Have you ever wondered what would happen if a single company had influence over Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Coca-Cola, Disney, JP Morgan, ExxonMobil, and thousands of other corporations at the same time? Not a government, not a country, not a king, a company. Now here is the crazy part. That company actually exists. It's called BlackRock. Today, BlackRock manages more than $10 trillion. That's more money than the GDP of almost every country on Earth. More than Germany, more than Japan, more than the United Kingdom. And yet, most people have never heard of it. You probably know Apple, you know Tesla, you know Netflix, but BlackRock, almost nobody talks about it. Which raises a disturbing question. How can one company become one of the most powerful organizations in human history, without most people even noticing? And if BlackRock is so powerful, who is controlling BlackRock? To answer that question, we need to go back to the late 1980s. Back when BlackRock was nothing, no trillion-dollar empire, no influence over global markets, just a handful of people sitting in an office trying to solve a problem, and that problem would eventually help them conquer Wall Street. The story begins with a man named Larry Fink. Today, he's one of the most powerful people in finance, but back then, he was just another ambitious banker. And then, he made a mistake. A massive mistake, one that cost his company around $100 million in a single trade. For most people, that would end a career. For Larry Fink, it changed everything. Because after losing that money, he became obsessed with one idea: risk. He wanted to understand risk better than anyone else. He wanted to predict it, measure it, control it. That obsession would become the foundation of BlackRock. In 1988, Larry Fink and a small group of partners launched a new company. The mission sounded simple: help investors understand risk. At first, nobody paid much attention. Wall Street was crowded. Thousands of firms competed for clients. BlackRock was tiny. But they had something different. They weren't selling dreams. They were selling data. And data was becoming incredibly valuable, especially as financial markets grew more complex. Every year, investors poured more money into stocks, bonds, and funds. And every year, understanding risk became harder. BlackRock built systems that could analyze enormous amounts of information. While other firms relied on intuition, BlackRock relied on machines, and one machine would change everything. Its name was Aladdin. Yes, like the Disney character. But this Aladdin wasn't granting wishes. It was helping institutions manage trillions of dollars. Aladdin became one of the most sophisticated financial systems ever created. Banks used it, governments used it, pension funds used it, insurance companies used it. The system analyzed investments, measured risk, tracked assets, and helped institutions make decisions. Over time, Aladdin became the financial industry's operating system. Imagine if almost every airline used the same navigation software, or every hospital used the same medical system. That's essentially what happened in finance. And the more institutions used Aladdin, the more powerful BlackRock became. But technology alone wasn't enough. BlackRock needed scale, and that's where things got interesting. In 2008, the world experienced the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. Banks collapsed, markets crashed, millions lost jobs, panic spread everywhere, and while most companies were fighting to survive, BlackRock was becoming indispensable. Governments needed help understanding toxic assets, central banks needed expertise, financial institutions needed guidance, and BlackRock had exactly what they needed. Its risk models, its data, its technology, its influence grew rapidly. Then came a move that changed everything. In 2009, BlackRock acquired Barclays Global Investors. Included in that deal was a business called iShares. Most people have never heard of iShares, but it transformed BlackRock into a giant, because iShares was one of the largest ETF providers in the world. ETFs are investment funds that allow ordinary people to buy hundreds of companies at once. Simple, cheap, convenient. Investors loved them. Money flooded in, and BlackRock was perfectly positioned. Year after year, trillions of dollars poured into ETFs, and BlackRock collected more assets, more influence, more power. Eventually, the company became the largest asset manager on Earth, managing over $10 trillion. But here is where things start getting strange. People often say, BlackRock owns everything. That's not exactly true. BlackRock doesn't own most of that money. Its clients do. Ordinary investors, pension funds, governments, retirement accounts. But even if BlackRock doesn't technically own the assets, it still controls how enormous amounts of capital are invested. And that distinction matters a lot because money is influence, and influence shapes decisions. Imagine sitting at a table where the CEOs of the world's biggest companies are discussing strategy. Now imagine you're one of their largest shareholders. Suddenly, your opinion carries weight. BlackRock became one of the largest shareholders in thousands of companies. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, the list goes on and on. Not because it bought those companies outright, but because investors kept pouring money into BlackRock-managed funds. And as those funds grew, so did BlackRock's voting power. This is where many conspiracy theories begin. People look at BlackRock's massive ownership stakes and conclude that it secretly controls the world. But reality is both less dramatic and more interesting. BlackRock doesn't wake up every morning deciding what products Apple should launch or what movies Disney should make. Corporate management still runs those businesses. However, BlackRock's influence is real. When a shareholder representing trillions of dollars speaks, companies listen. And that influence became especially visible in recent years. Issues like climate change, corporate governance, executive compensation, diversity initiatives. These topics suddenly became major conversations in boardrooms. Why? Because giant asset managers started paying attention, and BlackRock was often at the center of those discussions. Supporters argued that BlackRock was encouraging companies to think long-term. Critics argued that BlackRock had accumulated too much influence. The debate intensified, and so did BlackRock's visibility. But there was another problem hiding beneath the surface. The bigger BlackRock became, the more dependent the financial system became on it. Remember Aladdin, the risk management platform used across the industry? Today, it oversees and analyzes assets worth tens of trillions of dollars. If something affects Aladdin, it affects huge portions of the financial world. That's both impressive and terrifying, because concentration creates efficiency, but concentration also creates vulnerability, and that's a lesson history teaches again and again. The bigger something becomes, the harder it is to imagine it failing, until it does. Think about Lehman Brothers, think about Bear Stearns, think about long-term capital management. All seemed untouchable, until they weren't. Now, to be clear, BlackRock is not collapsing. Far from it. The company remains one of the strongest financial institutions on Earth. But its story reveals something fascinating about modern capitalism. Power no longer looks like it did centuries ago. Kings had armies, empires had colonies, industrial giants had factories. Today's power often comes from information, data, networks, and capital allocation. BlackRock mastered all three. That's why a company most people have never heard of became one of the most influential organizations in history. Not through force, not through politics, but through finance. And perhaps that's the most surprising part of this entire story. BlackRock didn't conquer the world voluntarily handed it influence. Millions of investors wanted cheaper products. Institutions wanted better risk management. Governments wanted expertise. And step by step, decision by decision, dollar by dollar, BlackRock became bigger than anyone imagined. Which brings us to the final lesson. Most people think power comes from owning things. Sometimes it does. But in the modern economy, power often comes from managing things, from connecting systems, from becoming so useful that everyone depends on you. That's exactly what BlackRock did. And whether you see that as brilliant innovation or a dangerous concentration of influence depends on one question. When a company becomes powerful enough to influence the world's biggest businesses, who is watching the company? Because if history teaches us anything, it's that the most important risks are usually the ones nobody sees coming. And that's what makes BlackRock one of the most fascinating stories in modern finance.